Welcome to another episode of our video series of the Philosophical History with Contemporary Critique. It is genuinely excellent to be back. This stack of sources our listener put together is, well, it's fascinating. How are you doing today?
I am excellent, thank you. I've spent the morning revisiting the specific frequency ranges of human speech, which is not my usual morning coffee routine. And you.
I'm ready to jump in. It's not every day you get to discuss an existential crisis delivered through a 4-second sound clip.
Right.
We're talking, of course, about the whole Yanny and Laurel thing, that auditory illusion that just completely took over the internet a few years back.
It was a remarkable moment, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, you had a situation where two people could listen to the exact same sound file, the same piece of data.
And hear two totally different things.
Completely different, mutually exclusive things. One hears Yanny, the other hears Laurel, and boom, you're immediately thrown into, well, one of the most fundamental philosophical questions there is. If our senses can't even agree on something that simple, can we ever really trust our perception of reality at all?
And that's our mission for this discussion. We're going to analyze the limits of perception and how rational thought tries to find a way through that maze. But before we get to the heavy philosophy, let's just unpack the mechanics. Where did this mysterious little clip actually come from?
Well, and this is what makes it so perfect. It started in the most mundane way you can imagine.
Right.
It was from a pronunciation website. They'd hired an opera singer to record a whole list of words. The two words in question were lore and Yanny.
And the clip that went viral was just this ambiguous recording of one of them.
Exactly. It was ambiguous enough that, depending on who was listening, your brain could interpret it as either one.
It felt like some kind of magic trick, but there was a very real technical reason for it.
Oh, absolutely. It all comes down to something called frequency masking. The key insight is that the sound for Laurel actually contains the frequencies needed to hear Yanny.
So Yanny is sort of hiding inside Laurel.
In a way, yes. Yanny exists in the higher frequencies, the trebles. Laurel is carried by the lower frequencies, the bass. So if you go in and digitally cut out all that bass, you basically strip away the Laurel cues, and suddenly all that's left are the high frequencies, and you hear Yanny.
And if you do the opposite, boost the bass,
you solidify Laurel. It drowns out the Yanny part.
So the information for both is technically there. Our ears and our brains just act like a filter, and they pick one over the other.
Precisely. And that filter is deeply personal, which brings us to the physiological side of things.
Age.
Age is a big one. We know that as we get older, typically after, say, 35 or 40, our ability to perceive those higher frequencies, it starts to diminish.
You lose the treble.
Lose the trebles. And while, normal human speech has enough range that we can all understand each other, a huge amount of auditory information is being filtered out or just plain lost by our aging ears.
And the neat theory at first was, okay, older people hear Laurel because they can't pick up the high-frequency Yanny data, and younger people hear Yanny.
That was the leading hypothesis, and that makes perfect scientific sense. But the sources gave us that wonderful little piece of counter-evidence.
The 12-year-old.
The 12-year-old who clearly heard Laurel. And that just stops you in your tracks. It means you can't just write it off as simple physiology. You have to look at the brain.
The psychological factor. The brain isn't just a passive receiver.
No, it's an active participant. A specialist from the University of Texas pointed out that the original recording was, in his words, dirty.
Noisy.
Very noisy, full of static competing signals. And that messiness, that's an invitation for the brain. When sensory data is ambiguous, the brain hates a vacuum. It jumps in and fills in the gaps.
And that's the real takeaway for you, the listener right there. Perception isn't passive, it's an active construction. We tend to hear what we expect to hear.
The brain is running its most anticipated program. And the crisis begins when you realize the person standing next to you is running a completely different program.
You saw it online. People who were certain they heard Yanny were genuinely distressed. They were panicked.
Of course. The reaction was, if we can't agree on this, on basic sensory input, who is right? Who is actually thinking correctly?
It's what you called the relativistic nightmare. If my senses say X and yours say Y and we're both completely sure, what authority is there left to appeal to?
None. And it's not just sound. The sources immediately draw the parallel to that other viral phenomenon, the dress.
The blue and black or white and gold dress, it was the same fight.
Exactly the same. And the resolution was also about psychological expectation. Your brain makes a subconscious assumption about the lighting.
Is it natural daylight or artificial indoor light?
Right. And that single unconscious assumption changes how your brain processes the color data. The object is fixed, but the observer's internal settings dictate the outcome.
The moment you realize your internal settings are that powerful, the philosophical ground just starts to crumble. And this is not a new problem, is it?
Not at all. As the historical sources show, this is ancient. The Greeks were wrestling with this thousands of years ago.
Who are we talking about here?
Well, we can go back to Xenophanes, a pre-Socratic philosopher. He had this beautiful way of putting it, especially with taste. He said in one of his fragments that if God hadn't created honey, we would all think figs were the sweetest thing imaginable.
So sweetness isn't a property of the fig, it's relative.
It's entirely relative. It depends on context, on what you have to compare it to.
And the problem gets even worse when the observer, the person doing the tasting, is also changing.
Yes, and this is what sends philosophy into what I called its hellish corner. It's the problem of the changing subject. Take the person drinking wine. When they're sick, the wine tastes bitter. When they're well, the same wine tastes good. So is the wine bitter or good? If the measuring device, the human, is constantly fluctuating, changing its physical state, how can you ever be sure you're wrong about the object, the wine?
Maybe you're not. Maybe you're just changing.
Exactly. And that path leads directly to total skepticism about whether we can know anything objectively at all.
And this kind of relativism, the skepticism, it seems to pop up during specific moments in history.
It does. It blooms when cultures start mixing. Xenophanes saw it in his own time. He noticed that different cultures made their gods look like themselves.
Ethiopians had dark-skinned, curly-haired gods.
And the Thracians had gods with red hair. He understood that our deepest beliefs are relative to our own culture. You see it again in the 5th century BC, and then big time in the 17th and 18th centuries with global exploration.
When you meet enough people who are just as certain as you are, but believe the complete opposite,
you're forced to start doubting your own certainty.
and that tension between a subjective cultural belief and some kind of single rational authority, that's still at the heart of our most difficult modern conflicts.
It's absolutely central, and our source material pushes us right into one of the thorniest modern examples. Mandatory vaccinations or medical treatments for certain cultures or tribes.
This is Yanny Laurel, but with life or death stakes.
It is. On one side, you have the rationalist position. They have the scientific data. They believe they have the objective truth about disease.
And they might feel justified in being coercive for the greater good.
The rationalist is saying, I hear Laurel, and you must hear Laurel because the frequency data proves it's Laurel.
And on the other side,
You have the relativist or the identity position. And they often see themselves as libertarian, as fighting against the tyranny of this, oppressive rationalism.
they're saying my experience, my tradition, tells me it's Yanny, and you have no right to impose your Laurel reality on me.
Precisely. And this is where we have to be so careful with reason itself. Reason is an incredible tool, but history is littered with examples of what was claimed to be objective reason being used for, oppressive treatment.
So the sources warn that reason should never be a comfortable garment.
Never. True intellectual health demands that everyone, even the scientist with all the data, has to doubt their own position.
That makes sense for intellectual humility, but it hits a wall in the real world, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The source mentions someone refusing life-saving treatment because of their beliefs. That person wasn't practicing healthy doubt. They were dying because of their absolute certainty.
And that's the paradox. Doubt is an extension of reason. It's our safeguard. But how do you compel someone to doubt when their entire identity, maybe their comfort in the face of death, depends on their unwavering conviction?
It's an impossible question. So if our senses are flawed, and even rational certainty can be dangerous, how does philosophy find a way out? It feels like we're trapped in Plato's cave.
That's a perfect way to put it. The cave analysis. We've been shown that the shadows on the wall, our perceptions, aren't the real objects. We need to learn about optics and physics to get out.
So who gives us the escape route?
This is the monumental contribution of 17th century rationalism, and specifically the work of René Descartes.
Right.
He looked at this problem of the changing subject, the untrustworthy senses, and he made a radical move. He said, "My senses have deceived me even once. Therefore, as a method, I will assume they might deceive me always."
This is Methodic Doubt. And he's not just doubting if he left the oven on.
No, this is fundamental. He assumes everything could be a lie. His body, the room he's in, the entire world. Maybe it's all a dream. Maybe he's a brain in a jar.
He takes skepticism to its absolute limit.
He does. But he uses it as a tool. He's searching for one single thing that he absolutely cannot doubt. And in that process, he finds it.
And it's not some external truth like Plato's ideas?
No. The truth isn't in the thing being thought about. For Descartes, the truth is in the thinker.
You can't doubt that you're doubting.
You can't. If you are doubting, you must exist as a thing that doubts. Even if you're being completely fooled, the one thing you can't be fooled about is the fact that you are there being fooled. The existence of a thinking being is the one unavoidable primary truth.
Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am.
That's the bedrock. It doesn't depend on eyes or ears. It depends only on the fact of your own consciousness.
So let's bring that foundation back to Yanny and Laurel. How does this help us? You have an analogy in the notes. Reason as depth perception.
It's a great way to think about it. Imagine a single lens camera. You get a flat image. Now, if you take two flat images from two separate cameras and put them side by side, you still just have two flat images.
You don't get depth. So just collecting perceptions, I hear Yanny, you hear Laurel, that doesn't give us the full picture.
No, it's reason that adds the depth. Reason is like the second eye. It steps back, it analyzes the difference between the two images, it understands frequencies, it considers the aging air, it factors in psychological expectation.
It provides the structure to understand why we're perceiving differently.
That's it, exactly. And that's maybe the difference between science and philosophy here. Science looks at the mechanism, the frequencies. Philosophy steps back and questions the camera itself, our very ability to know.
And Descartes' need for this radical approach, it didn't come out of nowhere. It was a product of his time.
Absolutely. The 17th century was a whirlwind. Global trade, exploration, new cultures flooding into Europe. It created a new wave of relativism that deeply shook the foundations of European certainty. Descartes' work was a direct response to that historical shock.
And we see that pattern again and again. These huge historical shocks are what force philosophy to change.
We do. Think of the Lisbon earthquake in the 18th century, a catastrophe that just physically shattered assumptions about a divine ordered world when rich and poor neighborhoods collapsed together.
It forced a complete rethink.
A total restructuring of assumptions.
Yeah.
And our sources confirm that what we're all living through now, this global pandemic, it will inevitably have the same kind of profound influence.
Yeah.
Crises force us to rebuild our foundations of truth. That's what Descartes was doing.
So, to bring it all back to that person still listening to the sound file, toggling between Yanny and Laurel, the core takeaway here is that the controversy isn't about which word is correct.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing the fundamental unreliability of our senses.
And the power of methodical doubt of rationality to give us a firm place to stand, a ground for knowledge that goes beyond that immediate flawed sensory data.
Our senses can be fooled, but the fact that we are a thinking, doubting being that is immutable, that's the exit from the cave. It moves you from just perceiving to critically analyzing.
A pretty profound resolution for a silly internet meme.
It is. And, just to leave you with one final thought on this.
Yeah.
When we talk about things we can't perceive, like ghosts or something, and we conclude through reason that they don't exist, the really interesting philosophical task isn't just proving their non-existence, it's grappling with the centuries of powerful, intense belief in them. The puzzle isn't always the reality itself, but the potent, persistent belief that people build around it.
And that belief is what actually shapes history and drives conflict, whether the thing is real or not.
Exactly.
A powerful thought to end on. Thank you for this. It's been a fascinating discussion.
My pleasure. Until next time.